Hi Nick.
Hello.
And we're talking about the amazing McQueen series that we've started on SHOWstudio, which has seen you go through your archive and look up all the old footage that you shot at the time. The first question I want to ask doesn't actually pertain to Lee McQueen. It's why have you always filmed your photo shoots? Because you filmed everything, and I think that really became obvious when we went through your archive.
Okay, so off topic a little bit then. I started in about 1988, I think. Because I had previously been photographing Naomi Campbell when she was 17 for Yohji Yamamoto, and she arrived at the studio and she put on this brilliant, beautiful scarlet Yohji Yamamoto coat and then walked up and down as I photographed her to the sound of a cassette she had from her friend Prince, which is an unreleased version of his new album. And I just thought, this is incredible, this is a bit of living fashion theatre. She looked so great, she moved so brilliantly, and this soundtrack, and there were 6 people who saw that. So I thought, well, for posterity I should film everything. So at that point I started putting just a simple camera on a tripod. I tell everybody in the room, you know, there's a camera filming, are you okay? And everybody says yes, other than David Bowie and Twiggy. And everybody says yes, and that was it. So and ever since.
Quite obsessive, because that's one of the things that struck me when we were going through all the footage of your sort of collaborations with Lee McQueen. Is you really filmed everything. You know, you filmed occasions where you're kind of interviewing him. You filmed phone calls and you know, everything.
I mean, it does and did get a bit obsessive. I mean, partly it became SHOWstudio, but it's also because I felt so, and I still feel, that we are privileged to see such fantastic things happening in front of our eyes, and just to keep them in the realms of a little sort of sphere that then disappears, and the only witness to that is a series of photographs. I think it's a shame. You know, what I would love to see a kind of a Cecil Beaton shoot, or a Munkaski shoot, or a Steichen shoot, or how lovely it would be to see those photographers working. And there's very little evidence of photographers working. So it was that, and also it was the idea that it wasn't bringing a film crew in. So it wasn't the idea that you'd have this sort of alien sort of
behind the scenes crew.
Because they never know the sort of the delicate politics of the studio. They never know the sort of delicate psychology of the studio. So it was to have something from an eye from the inside, if you want. And it didn't, for a long time, it really was just an unmanned camera just being changed. Of course, what happens is an unmanned camera also has a microphone on it. So you get a lot of very candid commentary. So you hear a lot of things. I mean, I've got hours, days, years of tapes, just because I haven't gone back through.
But you don't often go through it, do you? Because when we've been going through this stuff, the interview we're going to talk about here, the White interview, which is from kind of, it's the mid-90s, so it's really early on, just when you first started collaborating with Lee. You didn't really remember you had it, did you? Is that quite...
No, I absolutely didn't, because when you do a project, tapes go in boxes and you don't really go back and look at them unless you're called to go back and look at them. So no, a lot of this stuff's been a real sort of surprise seeing it again. And also, I've lived through the shoot. I don't want to spend my weekends going back through and rewatching my performance. Not quite like that.
Yourself. So you tell me, because I just kind of mentioned that you first started working with Lee McQueen. It was on the Florence Biennale, which was 1996. Tell me how because that wasn't how you kind of first interacted with him. You'd seen him around, and tell me how you first kind of came into contact with him.
Well, it was quite touching and quite sweet, really. I can't exactly remember what happened first, but I do remember 2 events that were the beginning of my relationship with him. I would get, for a couple of Christmases, I'd get a fax from Lee McQueen. Just a sort of funny thing would turn up out of the fax machine, which would be a sort of Happy Christmas, Lee McQueen. So I thought, that's nice. And then I met him for the first time sort of in person. We were both invited to a Vogue Christmas party, which is very sweet of Vogue to do these Christmas parties, but I hate them. I just don't, and parties aren't my thing. And Lee looked exactly like he felt the same way. And as I was leaving slightly early from this party, somebody said, there's a chap who's been sending you faxes. So I went over and said hello to him. And he was fine, kind of bored and grumpy, but very sweet, and there's something kind of human and engaging, and something obviously sparked between us. And I also, at the time, I'd come across his clothes. We're shooting a lot for Vogue, American Vogue at the time, and Camilla Nickerson, who later worked with Lee on lots of his shows, would always bring his clothes onto the shoot. So I'd go and look at the clothes rail to see what I was photographing, and there'd be kind of all this stuff, which was great, but fine, just stuff for American Vogue. And it'd be this amazing piece of clothes. It's like for a photographer, for an image maker, having a piece of clothing like a piece from Lee is so imbued with kind of narrative that there it is, the picture's done, just put it on a model, and it's kind of, so it was really exciting, and he knew. And then Camilla would say, but we're not photographing it. just brought it to the studio.
Really
So, which is,
heartbreaking.
a little heartbreaking. So I kind of had this sort of slightly odd, delicate relationship with him. And it started, I guess the first thing we did together was the Florence Biennale.
And tell me about working on that, because those images are really, really, I think, almost set the tone for the imagery that you produced with Lee. That's how when I look at them, that's what I feel. You know, they're kind of very beautiful, but there's a violence to them, and they're quite sinister, but then they're very inviting at the same time.
Yeah. Well, they were based because they're a strange form, so they're sort of jagged around the edges. They're actually based on prostitute cards from you used to get them in London. I don't know, you still do, but in telephone boxes. So call girls would put their business cards in, and it all has these kind of very kind of sort of flashy graphics on them. And Lee and I both particularly were keen on it. So the shapes of these big pictures were not sort of conventional squares or rectangles, but actually the sort of spiky things. And he wanted to do a series of pictures. One of which was his own head exploding, because that's how he said how he felt. Often we did portraits of him which reflected his kind of mood.
His mood, yeah.
I'm sure we'll talk about those later. But the idea was to do a series of pictures which are based on his loves, which were things like Hans Bellmer, Joel Peter Witkin. Lee had a fascination for lots of things which were, proximity to death, and fascination for the underworld, fascination for a whole range of things which were disturbing and dark and difficult, and that's the sort of things that fascinated him. I mean, not just sort of Satanist things, but things like watching films and he loved wildlife. So watching films, sort of Attenborough films of kind of sort of pursuit across the savannah of the kind of the antelope and the cheetah or whatever it was, and he would love that, and the passion and the power of the natural world was something that really fueled him. But then also the sort of interest in what a lot of people found difficult. A lot of people didn't see beauty in it, and Lee did. I remember
Which is quite like you as an image maker. Do you think that's why you gelled?
Yes, I think so. I guess we were both. Subversive isn't the right word. It sounds pretentious, but we didn't want to go with the mainstream. That's for sure. We didn't want to do things that were necessarily considered beautiful. We found beauty. He and I found beauty in other things, and it felt so much more thrilling. I'll give you an example of the sort of thing, way a project would start. And in fact, for one of this series, he said, "Right, Nick. Okay, so I want the girl to be in sewage, floating in sewage." So I go, "Okay." And Charlotte, who's now my wife and has produced most of my shoots, would say, "Well, look, Lee, you can't put a girl in sewage. It just doesn't work." So he thought of it and he said, "Oh, okay, maybe a sump oil." And Charlotte was like, "Well, actually, you know what? You can't put a human being in sump oil either." So then we suggested to him, "Well, how about black molasses, which is sort of super thick and dark, but like sort of Marmite, but thicker." And so instead of sewage or sump oil, this lovely model was pushed into molasses. Now, molasses is incredibly viscous. And so once you get her to go in there, first she doesn't sink, she lies on top of it, so you actually have to push her into it. So we made a sort of swimming pool in the studio and put the girl in molasses. Because then when she's been in there, when we took the pictures, you can't get her out.
Oh God, poor thing.
She's stuck. So a lot of the shoots were quite physically demanding and challenging, and also aesthetically challenging. How do you make a girl look beautiful when she's up to here in shiny sump oil or molasses? So a lot of those pictures were about that, and yes, I think they did start to set the tone of the sorts of things that we both liked. And it was always a thrill when Lee would phone me and sort of say, "Okay, I've got an idea," or "I've got a thought," or "Why don't we?" Because you knew it was going to push our own boundaries. So you knew we were going to do things that perhaps we certainly hadn't done before. Never ever wanted to repeat himself. Very seldom wanted to photograph his clothes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So beautiful clothes, and you say, "I don't want to, let's do them nude," or
it seems about a world and about an idea more than about. But this first series of pictures were exhibited in Florence as part of the sort of art fair down there. He was never that enamoured with the art world as such. I think that he found it frustrating because he felt, and quite rightly, I think, that he was a true artist. And he would express himself through fashion as opposed to painting or sculpture. And he felt he wasn't taken seriously, or not taken, but he felt he got less respect because of that than artists that he would not sort of see as his level. Yeah, and it's important to remember also, I guess, at the time that the fashion press also weren't that enamoured with him. It's not like he was getting kind of the undivided support of the fashion press and being shunned by the art press. He was kind of struggling, I think, to find a path and have people understand his work.
Yeah, I think when he's starting, but also the other thing is, of course, now one looks back at it and sort of tragically he's no longer here. the thing is now, of course, you look back at Lee McQueen and it's this huge personality, and it represents so many things that we all accept within the fashion world. The success of his business, the sort of character, the things that he's spawned in terms of the looks in the world. So all that's huge. But at the time, it's a young, fairly rotund kid from the East End of London who wasn't really sort of being accepted by people and felt he wanted to do it his way, and he had such a sort of pugnacious way of speaking.
And I think that's what comes across so beautifully in this interview. He's so, you see that vision, don't you? And you can tell he knows what he likes and he knows what he's about, but it's the contradictions that come across, and the mixture. He's talking about things that are quite, almost quite hard, like the dark balance between dark and light, and just that laugh is so amazing. He
had such a kind of odd way of speaking, and I've said this in an interview the other day actually, for GQ, but actually it made it very enjoyable because his voice patterns weren't moderated like mine are or yours are, where we stay roughly on the same tone, or he'd go from this kind of quite sort of mumbly and a raucous laughter, dirty laugh that would punctuate the conversations, which made him just very enjoyable to speak to.
I guess it's quite like watching one of the collections. You don't quite know what's going to happen.
No,
next.
there was some of that in just how he'd speak. But the one amazing thing about working with him was his speed of comprehension. So he would be able to see the idea so much faster than anybody around him, myself included. And he would get quite frustrated that other people would have to catch up. So meetings with Lee, and often we at that time it was at Hoxton Square, but later it was sort of elsewhere in East End. But meetings with Lee were always fairly kind of, Lee would deliver the idea or the thought or the desire of what he wanted to do, and then we'd all start talking about it as if we were trying to catch up. And by that time, Lee was off. I remember one particular moment, which I'm not sure I should say, but whatever, where he came, we had doing a thing with Bjork. And Bjork was expressing how she wanted to do, and Bjork expressed this by sort of, she's very theatrical. So Bjork was on the floor and turning around and explaining how, but Lee just walks off at this point. I'm left with Bjork on the floor turning around and said, okay. It's a slightly, but he had no sort of, he wasn't worried about sort of speaking his mind, being super frank. And that made him, stimulating company, but not dangerous, it's not the right word. But you were never quite sure. I had a meeting with him with an art dealer, a big art dealer at the time, who wanted to put on a show of our work, which is great, lovely compliment. But there's a certain protocol to how you speak to our big art dealers. Lee would have none of it. So we sat down for the meeting, and the gentleman concerned sat in front of us, and Lee's opening comment was, right, how much money have you got, and how long, because I'm in a hurry. And that was sort of, that was how he would be, because he needed to know that. He needed to know whether the guy had £10,000 or £100,000 or £1 million to do this project, and when he had to deliver it by. But the guy was so shocked by that sort of very direct approach that it completely threw the meeting. So
tell me, after you finished collaborating with him on this set of pictures and they were kind of all displayed, did you kind of walk away from the project and think, this is the start of a continued creative relationship?
Yes, it's a simple answer to that. It was such a thrill. So I knew I wanted more, and he seemed to also want more. So yes, we both knew we wanted to go on working together. I mean, to be honest, Louis went up in Florence. I never saw it. I never got invited out there. I'm not even sure he went out there. Oh yeah, he probably did actually. But it wasn't an event that happened in that way. But I think by the time it came out, we were already kind of excited to be doing things together and on to the next thing. So yeah, it was clear from the beginning that we wanted to work together.
That you'd keep going. Thank you, Nick.
Pleasure.